Hey everybody, it's Don from G411. In today's edition of G411, we're going to be talking about steering, specifically on the JL and the Gladiator. Stay tuned. Today we have a couple questions for you. First, what's the worst trail repair you might have to undertake in your Jeep? And there's a simple answer to that, and that would be broken steering. It's extremely difficult to get off the trail with broken steering because you can't really tow, and it just takes a huge amount of work to do that. And the other question is, what's the worst thing that can happen to you on the highway, short of a nasty crash or maybe getting lost? And I would have to say that's death wobble. If you own a Jeep or any vehicle with a solid axle can have death wobble. So both of those are big issues, and there are significant issues on the JLs and Gladiators, and there's some reasons for that and some things we've recently discovered. You might wonder why we're doing this while we're driving. Well, it's not because we're expecting death wobble, because we're not. And we're not going out on the trail, so getting stuck isn't going to be a big deal. But we just installed the Currie Extreme 60 axles with Yukon gear and axle, 538 ratio gears, and we're breaking those in today. So we're cruising around, changing speeds, following the Yukon gear break-in procedures, and we'll see what happens. But while we're doing that, it's a really good time to talk about steering on the JL and the Gladiator. If you remember a few months ago, actually back in 2018, so a couple years ago, shortly after the JL came out, there were a lot of complaints about how the steering felt and how the vehicle was wandering. And those were legitimate complaints. It seems to have gotten a little bit better over time, but there was a recall, and the solution was to install a steering stabilizer, which helps dampen out those forces, makes the feel a little bit better because it makes it tighter. But the other thing that's been happening on the JLs and now the Gladiators is death wobble. And that happens especially when you go up in tire size, because the forces are greater when you go up from a stock size tire, or even the 33-inch tires on the Rubicon, to say a 35 or especially a 37 or 40-inch tire. The rotational inertia, which is the force created by the rotating tire and how far that weight is from the center of rotation. The bigger the tire, the more the rotational inertia becomes. That causes problems by putting more load on the steering system. So death wobble has been an issue on the JLs and now the Gladiators, even with a stock setup. And I think part of the problem occurs when you hit a nasty pothole or bump in the road just right with one tire, and that can set up an oscillation, and that can start a death wobble. If there's any slop in the steering system, that gets worse. So that's just something you need to be aware of. Even with a stock vehicle, that can happen. Once it happens, it can cause damage. Now, there are several causes for death wobble, and that's been pretty well documented. The most common is worn ball joints. Worn ball joints are a common fix for death wobble. Some things that can make death wobble worse include tires out of balance. It's really important, especially with larger tires, 35s, 37s, 40-inch tires, to have the tires dynamically balanced. That helps reduce those forces, makes the tires a little more stable. Other things that can cause death wobble are any worn joints in the steering or the suspension, the front suspension. It could be trailing arms, which is less likely, but it could be the tie rod, the drag link, or the track bar. Loose joints in those or rod ends can cause death wobble. But again, the biggest problem is caused by worn ball joints. But that isn't the only thing that can cause it. There have been a lot of complaints about death wobble especially on the JLs because they've been around longer. One of the things that's come about is a Technical Service Bulletin, a TSB, and we'll put down there on the comments or in the description a link to that TSB that is talking about one of the problems with the wandering. They're saying it doesn't really affect any kind of vibrations or shimmying. They're not saying death wobble because that's not quite a technical term. But they're saying that this won't cure it, but it's a replacement steering box for the JL. And it's really fascinating what's going on with Jeep and the JL and now the Gladiators. The steering on the JLs and now the Gladiators is an aluminum steering box, obviously with steel gears inside that box and a steel sector shaft, and an electric power steering pump as opposed to the mechanical belt-driven pumps that came on the JK and a lot of other vehicles, almost all vehicles over the years. So that electric power steering pump is something new. But the aluminum steering box was put in to save weight, and the aluminum steering box was put in to save weight, and the electric power steering pump was designed to take drag off of the engine itself. Both of those were designed to improve fuel economy because corporate fuel economy numbers are very important to manufacturers. That's the CAFE numbers, the corporate average fuel economy. So by improving those, it's actually keeping or minimizing the chance that the manufacturer is going to get financially dinged for having a corporate fuel economy average that's too low. So that was one of the solutions that Jeep came up with, or two of them, in the steering system to help improve fuel economy. Well, the lightweight power steering box made out of aluminum isn't particularly strong, and it can flex, but more importantly, that steering box gets hot. There's no power steering cooler stock on the JLs or Gladiators. So that fluid gets hot, the box heats up, and the expansion rate of aluminum is much different than the expansion rate of the steel parts within that box. And that can cause a higher clearance, which can cause some free play, and that's most likely the cause of the wandering. But it can also loosen up the sector shaft, cause some slop in the sector shaft, and that can actually help initiate death wobble. So recently we had an interesting experience with the JL I'm driving right now, our Jeep 411 project. We installed, as you know, the Currie Extreme 90 axles, and we decided to test the Currie 60s with the stock steering and 40-inch Mickey Thompson Baja Boss tires on 17-inch Raceline Monster beadlocks. We just wanted to see how it handled because we had no steering issues with the 37-inch tires we were testing before that. So we literally made it less than a quarter mile. We didn't even get to the first stop sign leaving the All J product shop when we had really serious death wobble kick in. Now this is on a brand new axle. Nothing is worn out on that axle. The steering is all in good shape. And we started exploring what could be the cause of that death wobble. Now our plan from day one was to go with the PSC complete power steering system, including the hydraulic ram assist for the JL, because of the kind of wheeling we plan to do with this Jeep. But we wanted to test the stock steering first. Well, I'm glad we did, because we had this crazy death wobble right out of the box. And one of the first things we noticed is we didn't have enough caster in the front axle and the steering to help stabilize that. So that might have been a part of the cause that initiated it. But the street we were on was also had some big bumps and ruts in it. And as soon as we hit one of those, we got death wobble. So that was unfortunate, kind of ended our test way sooner than we thought it would have. So we went back to the shop, did some checking, adjusted the caster, still had death wobble. So in talking to people like Ray Currie from Currie Enterprises, the best solution was to just go ahead, bite the bullet, and install the PS power steering, which we did and which I'm driving on today. And we've been over a number of bumps since I've been talking with absolutely no issues. The PSC power steering totally cures all the issues. Plus, it's a great product, and it's great when you're off-roading. One of the problems with the stock JL steering, and on the Gladiator also, and Quinn has experienced this on his JL, on his Gladiator, is the fact that when you get in the big rocks, the steering effort is very high because the power steering isn't very powerful. Specifically, the pump doesn't put out a whole lot of pressure to assist in the steering effort. So it makes the steering effort really high when you get up against rocks. So you have to muscle the steering, which is not good for any component on the steering. Quinn has also indicated recently that he's having the very first signs, just a little bit of wiggle on the steering when he goes over bumps in his Gladiator. So he will be replacing, in fact, he's already ordered the PSC steering, the same system we have on the JL here. It should arrive Monday, so he's going to try to get that in next week as soon as he can, because A, he doesn't want death wobble, and B, he wants to do a little more hardcore wheeling and not have any problems. So that's a pretty interesting scenario with the stock gearbox. And obviously, from our experience, the PSC power steering is a great solution. It's much stronger. And here's an interesting fact about the difference between the PSC big bore steering box and the stock aluminum box on the JL. When we pulled the box off, we weighed the aluminum box, came in with the pitman arm attached at 22.5 pounds, which is very light for a steering box. By contrast, the steering box from PSC, the big bore box, weighed 51 pounds. Now, I'm not a big fan of adding weight to a vehicle, but I'll tell you what, I'll take that extra weight in a steering box just because it's going to be way, way stronger. And where that is really important, we talked about trail breakdowns. If you have a broken steering on the trail, it's a real pain in the butt to get a recovery going and to get off the trail. It can be done, but man, it can take hours, or it means replacing possibly a steering linkage, or worse, a steering box on the trail if you have access to one. So that can be a real pain. So the sector shafts have always been a weak link, even in the JKs. We didn't break one, but we had one wearing out, which is why we originally replaced the stock steering on our JK a few years ago with a PSC steering system, power steering system for the JK. That solved all the problems. We've never had an issue again, and that's been at least 4 years, maybe longer. So breaking a sector shaft means the sector shaft is the shaft in the steering box that the gears turn, that turn the pitman arm, that allows you to steer the vehicle. And if that breaks, you have no steering whatsoever. And that's a real pain because you have to replace the box. And trying to tow out just is a nightmare. So going with a heavy-duty box is a big deal. Well, one of my concerns about a stock steering box, especially with an aluminum box itself, was that sector shaft wearing out or causing problems. Well, it turns out that the box itself may be causing problems because of a slop in the steering. That's certainly causing some field issues. But as soon as we replaced this power steering system with the PSC, we had no issues. And the steering feel is a lot better. It's a very light feel because it's a pretty aggressive system with the Ram Assist steering stabilizer. But the other factor that could be an important thing to consider with the free play is I'm curious about the power steering pump, that electric pump that's driven by an electric motor rather than a belt off of the front of the engine. And my concern about that relates to the pump being able to keep up with the steering. Part of that wandering, especially when things get hot, could simply be the steering box or the steering pump not putting out enough pressure consistently enough to make for good steering feel. So when you replace, that seems to not be a problem once the steering stabilizer has been put on, but the replacement box that Mopar now has a part number for, and we'll also put that down in the introduction to this video so you have that part number. That also seems to be helping that problem. So I think there's a combination of things going on, but we highly recommend a PSC power steering system for those reasons. Now, Mopar is offering a replacement box that is made out of cast iron that obviously is going to weigh a lot more. So I find it interesting that they're doing that, but even more interesting, which we just found out when we started to research this problem, is that the new Wranglers, the JLs and Gladiators, and pretty much anything from the middle of the 2020 model year, so anything that was delivered maybe in June or July that might have been built a couple months before that. We bought this in May and it had the aluminum box at the end of May. But people have been buying, one guy reported buying a JL, took delivery at the end of June, and it had the, guess what? The cast iron power steering box installed from the factory. Now supposedly with this TSB, this Technical Service Bulletin that came out, a Jeep dealer will replace the power steering box, the stock aluminum power steering box, with a new cast iron steering box, we've heard, at no cost. But now that they're being put on new Jeeps from the factory, we've heard that the supplies are very, very limited. And those supplies, it might take a while to get a steering box. One of the other interesting things on the Mopar website, where you used to be able to buy a replacement steering box, the aluminum boxes have been discontinued. So that's kind of telling that they really want to get rid of those things. I wouldn't be surprised if Jeep ends up recalling the earlier JLs and Gladiators for a steering box replacement. So stay tuned on that. But in the meantime, if you're a hardcore wheeler or if you've been having problems with the steering, especially with death wobble, and nothing seems to be fixing that problem, like replacing ball joints and making sure all the tie rod ends are new and solid and there's no free play in the drag link and tie rod and track bar, and that everything is balanced okay, you might want to consider the aftermarket power steering system and go for the PSC big bore system that they offer. It's not cheap, but boy, it's a lot better than having a breakdown in the trail, or worse, having death wobble on the highway, which is darn scary. So that's something to take into consideration, and hope you've enjoyed this video. I can't say that it's a particularly enjoyable topic, but we hope it's important and that it gives you some insights if you own a JL or a Gladiator. It could save you a lot of grief down the road. And for you JK owners, keep in mind that the PSC power steering system for the JK, especially the newer big bore steering box, is just an awesome upgrade. We've been extremely happy with it on our JK, and I really wouldn't have anything else. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time, so stay tuned.